Text. National Museum of Natural History. Smithsonian. Hot topic. The Wood Age. How were the earliest hunting weapons made and used? Featuring Annemieke Milks, lecturer in archaeology, University of Reading. April 16, 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. ET.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Hot Topic program, The Wood Age. How were the earliest hunting weapons made and used with Annemieke Milks? My name is Briana Pobiner, and I'm a paleoanthropologist and educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I'm a brown and gray-haired woman in a red patterned shirt and a brown cardigan, wearing headphones in front of a Zoom screen with an African savanna photo with grass and an acacia tree behind me. Whether this is your first time joining us for Hot Topics or you've attended before, we're so glad to have you here. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. This discussion offers closed captioning. You can turn the captions on or off via the CC button, which should be located at the bottom of your Zoom interface. We are in a webinar format, so we can't see or hear you. As you have questions, please go ahead and submit them to the Q&A box, which is at the top or bottom of your screen, so we can sort through as many of those as possible. Looks like two little speech bubbles. The Q&A time really flies by, and it's also where we will share any relevant links during the program, so keep an eye out there. So we'll start with a presentation by our speaker, and then I'll join her here to take your questions. During the presentation, I will also write answers to some of your questions, at least any that I can answer, as will another member of our behind-the-scenes team, Dr. Ryan McRae. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Annemieke Milks is a Paleolithic archaeologist and a lecturer at the University of Reading in England. Her research focuses on early hunting weaponry and experimental archaeology, the use of wood for tools, and the archaeology of children. She's currently studying the transition from wooden spears to stone-tipped weapons during the Middle and Late Pleistocene, and she's also an active member of the research team working on the wood remains from Schoningen, Germany. Her research has been featured in several documentaries, including for the BBC, the CBC, and History Hits. And now I'm excited to ask Dr. Milks to share her screen and give us her presentation.
Slide. The Wood Age. How were the earliest hunting weapons made and used? A picture of wooden spears and a list of logos.
Thank you so much. It's super exciting to be here today and to be able to talk to you all about not just my research, of course, but lots of different teams of people that I've collaborated with across Europe, but also in the Republic of Congo. Really trying to understand a little bit more about these extraordinary weapons from the archaeological record from the Pleistocene. And I somewhat provocatively titled this The Wood Age, which is also the title of a book that's been published recently, not by myself, because I think people are starting to engage in the fact that although we almost never see wood in the archaeological record, it was almost certainly a key component of in human evolution and right the way through until the present day, right? You look around you and we see wood everywhere as a really important material. And so these early weapons that I'm going to talk about today are challenging in a lot of ways, but some new discoveries in the last 10 years of wooden tools in general have helped us kind of drive forward how we look at them and how we kind of can interpret how they were both made and used. So I'm going to start today with talking about how they were used and the research I've done around trying to better understand how they might have been used. And then I'll talk about research on how they might have been made.
Slide. Pleistocene wooden find spots. Maps of several regions of the world with locations marked.
So here are just some maps, some kind of global find spots from the Pleistocene record. So just as a reminder, the Pleistocene, the key period for human evolution, round about from 2.6 million years ago till about 11,700,000 years ago. So a really long span of time. And I know that the sites here on your screen might be very, very small, but the key takeaway for you really is to think that across, several million years of time, we haven't got a lot of archaeological sites that have wood preservation. And not all of the sites here that are on this map are even very well accepted in terms of wood tools, as opposed to just preserved wood that might have been modified by humans or not. But a couple of key things to point out was just that the earliest site we have with for sure good preservation of materials that were for sure worked by humans comes from a site called Kalambo Falls in Zambia, and that dates to 476,000 years ago. And that was just published a few years ago. They already had wood tools from the site and preserved wood from much earlier excavations in the 1950s. But the analysis had been kind of problematic. So Larry Barham and colleagues went back and had a look and found this kind of really interesting, big structure of some sort of two interlocking logs. And then we have some other sites with various wood tools, and recent published site called Gantanching in China, which dates to about 300,000 years. So a range of different sorts of sites with different kinds of tools, which I'll show you in a moment.
Slide, European Pleistocene wooden weapons. A map of Northern Europe with locations marked.
And then these kinds of sites from the European Pleistocene record where we have preservation of wooden weapons themselves. So these are the earliest weapons in the archaeological record, probably not the actual earliest weapons, but because probably they just did the earlier ones just didn't survive. But these are the ones that we have, and that's what I'll focus on today. Primarily that site of Schöningen in Germany.
Slide, pictures of wooden weapons with their location and age.
So here is a kind of just a brief kind of snapshot of the sorts of things that we find from these European sites. So we've got, from the top left, the earliest going around clockwise to the most recent of these from pre-Homo sapiens sites, so Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis. We've got Maratusa in Greece, which we recently published. I'll talk about that very briefly at the end, where we've got maybe a digging stick made from alder. And then we've got these wooden weapons from Clacton on Sea. The earliest wooden weapon from Clacton dating to round about 400,000 years ago. It's broken, a broken U point. Most people are happy to call that a spear, a broken spear point. And then, of course, the site of Schöningen that I'll talk about today, probably dated to about 300,000 years ago, with a whole host of wooden tools now, but including these really important complete and nearly complete wooden spears, another type of weapon called a throwing stick, maybe these handles or pegs that are from another area, not from the spear horizon. And then we have these kind of multifunctional sticks from sites like Pageti Vecchi in Italy, where they were burning using fire to kind of char the boxwood to help them probably make and shape these very hardwood sticks, and other objects like that. So digging sticks and weapons and some other kind of enigmatic tools.
Slide, a graphic consisting of 6 text boxes in a circular pattern, each containing an area of study. A bullet point list corresponds to each text box.
Now, I did my PhD, my master's and my PhD on early weaponry. I still do early weaponry. I do other things too now, but I do, obviously I love weapons, studying weapons, because they're cool, they're really interesting. But I think, the reason that they continue to be interesting is that because there's this kind of nexus of different aspects of behavior, of physiology and cognition, so intelligence, planning, depth, and human evolution. So we can think about how that they might intersect with things like the evolution of language, whether or not teaching was needed to learn how to make and use these tools, things like social behavior, social group hunting and meat sharing, gender roles, things like that. And also people use, weaponry to think about things like group sizes, cooperative hunting, and how hominins and humans were able to kind of look at, inhabiting new challenging environments, how they might have used landscape for their hunting strategies. So all of these things kind of intersect with early weaponry.
Slide, Shonin in 1324, circa 300,000 years before present. A picture of several spears laid out in a row, and a close-up picture of a spear point.
So I was lucky enough to do, I did my PhD on these early wooden spears, but I then ended up doing a postdoc with this team in Hanover to document all of the preserved wood remains from what is called the Spear Horizon at Schöningen 1324. So that's the official site name from which the spears and these throwing sticks come. So here's a close-up of spear 2, so you can see how kind of beautiful the material is and how beautifully preserved they are. So they are broken and flattened in some cases. They're not always completely complete, as you can see in the picture by this recent paper led by my colleague Dirk Leder. But these shorter throwing sticks on the right, and actually it was one of these throwing sticks that I'll talk about in detail that was the first object discovered at the site. So a whole range of different weapons of different sizes and mostly made from slow-growing spruce. One of the spears is made from pine, and then a collection of different kind of strategies for making the throwing sticks themselves.
Slide, an illustration of an ecosystem containing a lake, woodlands, rivers and ponds, and grasslands. Illustrations of animals. A map of the area corresponding to the illustration.
Here's a kind of really nice reconstruction of what the landscape would have looked like at the time of that the spear horizon itself formed. This image made by Brigitte Orban and colleagues shows us this kind of landscape of this paleo lake, a lake shore where and a very kind of cool, open environment. So not a lot of tree cover, swampy areas around the lake shore itself, and a whole range of different sorts of prey animals, a lot of deer, horse, of course, which they were hunting at Schöningen, and also straight-tusked elephants, but also these predators in the landscape too, right? So we've got Homotherium latidens, which saber-toothed cats, so dangerous animals in the environment as well. And so we think potentially this elm ridge up here could have made a nice kind of vantage point for seeing these herds of horses and other prey animals down in the landscape.
Slide, an illustrated map showing a band of human activity in between a lake and a lakeshore. Symbols mark locations of spears.
And here's a reconstruction of the lake shore itself, where the finds have come from. And you can see the lake and then the human activities along that kind of in the periphery between this fluctuating lake and the lake shore itself. And what you can see here is I chose this particular image because you can see the sort of beige blobs are the spears themselves, so 1 through 10. And then the little green dots are those throwing sticks, throwing stick fragments. And then you can see in the kind of heat map the redder area, the focal point of the faunal remains, the animals that they were butchering. So you can see that the spears and most of the throwing sticks kind of don't necessarily intersect all that well. They're seem to be slightly different zone to the actual butchery activity area, which is interesting. But that whole strip of excavated excavated area is littered with different elements of the human activities and also the natural background stuff.
Slide, a picture of a grassy hill and a partially excavated mine. A bar graph, an illustration of a skeleton of a four-legged animal.
So it's important, I think, to take a bit of context of when, so when Schöningen was discovered, it was really revolutionary. It still is revolutionary and amazing and continues to amaze us. But when it was discovered by Hartmut Thieme, and it was discovered as a result of this massive open cast coal mine in Lower Saxony. And he recognized the potential of this site quite early on and kind of managed to negotiate rescuing the site, the rest of whatever had been already lost with them through the mining activities to kind of rescue it. And it still sits there, not exactly in this same format, but more or less like this today with a really nice museum next to it. And I think what you can see is just the massive scale of the excavations that were going on, the kind of precarity of it all, and it changed viewpoints at the time. You know, people thought that hominins at that time were only able to really scavenge; they were hunters. So the idea that Hartmut had initially with the site, because they only found a couple of weapons and some butchered horse remains, was that this was a kind of single mass butchery event, a mass hunting event, a single one, and that they killed the animals, butchered them, and left. Um, but subsequent decades of research by lots of different teams of people have looked at again at this question. And for example, this paper recently published by Jared Hudson and colleagues looking at the seasonality of the horse remains. These are the young horses and the seasons in which they died. And we can see that these horses that people were at Schoeningen and at that lakeshore over long period of time, hunting all year round. So this makes much more sense of the site where we've got lots of spears left behind, throwing sticks, and I think it's something over 50 butchered horses, as well as other butchered animals as well, butchered red deer, some oryx, and other animals like that.
Slide, a numbered list.
So when I first started doing my PhD research in 2013, I guess, there were a range of kind of dominant ideas around early weaponry. And I should say that, you know, sometimes I think Paleolithic archaeologists were like the last bastion of kind of colonial thinking around simplicity and technology and cognition and things like that. But anyway, the idea was that these early spears, could be contrasted with Homo sapiens innovations of spear throwers and darts and bow and arrow technologies, and that more or less everything about spears, whether wood-tipped or stone-tipped, would have been inferior to these later innovations like bow and arrows, that they were really heavy, that they'd be too difficult to throw, and that therefore if they are thrown, they're thrown at very short distances, they weren't accurate, they'd have very low velocities in flight, and they'd lose velocity in flight was one of the other things that's said in the literature. And therefore they were very kind of low energy impact weapons compared to some of these other innovations. And also finally that they were generally aimed at larger prey. So there were some problems. There were quite a few problems with these interpretations from my perspective. One was that they were kind of anecdotal. A lot of the evidence around how we interpreted the use of these weapons was anecdotal, and or it was underpinned by kind of ethnographic reference that wasn't very kind of comprehensive. It didn't look at a broad range of sources, a broad enough range.
Slide, a picture of a person throwing a spear, a picture of a spear impaling a bale of hay, illustrations of a man aiming a spear at a horse, and a list of spear ranges.
So I did a whole series of experiments in my PhD to try and test the wooden weapons, these wooden spear replicas, with experts rather than people like myself. So one of the things I got a lot was, you know, are you going to throw the spears yourself? No, because I'm not good at throwing, and I'm small and I have bad shoulders. So I got a whole variety of people who were more skilled at using spears. So we worked with javelin athletes and captured the release and impact velocity, had them throwing at a variety of distances. And this has been published for a while now. And I think, you know, it's probably safe to say that, you know, we can extend that idea of a 5-meter distance range for these spears to at least 15 to 20 meters if you have somebody who knows how to throw. That doesn't mean that they weren't also using them as thrusting weapons in contact spears, but the potential for the weapons themselves to fly in flight was demonstrated with this experiment. And I should say that subsequent documentaries that I've worked with even more skilled javelin athletes were really, they're not scientific necessarily, but they were really interesting for me in terms of what we call maybe anecdata, in that the highest level javelin athletes learned within an hour or so how to throw that spear at a longer distance and hit that target at 20 meters repeatedly. So that was really interesting to see how quickly some of that learning and adaptation to the tool itself can happen when you have someone who knows what they're doing. And similarly, a kind of review of the ethnographic literature around throwing distances. These lists of distances here are specifically are not specifically with wooden spears, but throwing spears in general, and that we can see there's a number of societies who were throwing spears for hunting as well as for violence at sometimes reportedly quite significant distances. So we always have to be a bit careful with ethnographic data, of course, but hopefully the picture is there, that the idea that they're 5 meter distance weapons seems a little bit unlikely now that we've done the experimental work.
Slide. A world map with numerous points marked on it and illustrations of various animals and a human.
Similarly, I did an ethnographic review of the literature looking at the distribution of the use of wooden spears specifically, and a lot of focus in Oceania and also in North America, again, both in terrestrial hunting as well as in violence. I didn't look at things like fishing. And showing a real range of different sizes of prey that were targeted with these wooden spears specifically, both thrusting and throwing, and also dangerous animals too. So things like jaguar and bear were also hunted with wooden spears. So very interesting to think about that whole wide range, but including small prey as well.
Slide. A map of Africa with a location marked in Republic of the Congo, and a bar graph showing the kinetic energy of spears, darts, and bows.
And then I wanted to kind of expand our thinking a little bit because I think I had this sense that we weren't taking into account enough the kind of skills and knowledge of people who do hunt with spears when we were characterizing spear use in general. And so I've worked with my colleagues Shayna Love-Levy and Francis Kiabia and Tamudila, who's in Republic of Congo, working with the Bayaka and Bandango communities in the rainforest who still hunt with spears now. So they hunt with iron-tipped spears, but they will both thrust and throw at short distances because they're in a rainforest. So they don't throw at long distances because it's a rainforest and it's hard to throw long distances. But what was really interesting is to see that the accuracy, at least at the short distances, is much, much better than our javelin athletes, which makes a lot of sense. And also kind of corroborating what we'd found with the javelin athletes and what other people who've done other spear throwing experiments since my own, showing actually the kinetic energies with throwing spears are very high. In fact, much higher than spear throwers and darts and bow and arrows, and thrusting spears are probably even higher than the throwing spears. So kind of overturning at least some of those theories about the limitations of spears. I think they have other limitations that are important to consider, but there are advantages of spears too, which helps to kind of explain why they continue to be used.
Slide. A picture of a double-pointed stick.
So I'm going to walk through a little bit of the more detailed analysis now of how we kind of came to study as part of a project led by Thomas Terberger in Hanover, how the wooden weapons themselves were made. So this is one of these throwing sticks in close up.
Slide. The stick marked with length and width measurements, a close-up view of the grain on the wood, a distribution map, and a graph.
And here we did a study then which looked in detail using microCT scanning and 3D microscopy, we were looking at features of the wood itself to understand what kind of wood they were selecting, how it was growing. But also, as you can see here, we can see where they worked away the annual rings so that they were how they were shaping the points, and then exactly sort of the sequence of different kinds of manufacturing sequences. So we could see how they were choosing the raw material.
Slide, Phase 0, Raw Material. Close-up images of the material, and an illustration of a tree with a variety of branches.
In this case, they were choosing a branch for this throwing stick. In this case of the spears, they were always tree trunks. So that's really interesting. And in the case of the spears and also the spears and the throwing sticks, they seem to make sure when they're then manufacturing them that the very inner pith, the softest part of the wood, does not come out at the very point of the front points of the spears and both ends of the throwing sticks. So we already knew this. This was not our own conclusion. It was already recognized, but it helps us think about that kind of the human's awareness of the raw materials.
Slide, Phase 1, Manufacture. Close-up views of the material from different angles and a bullet point list.
Again, with this 3D microscopy, we could see how they were shaping and flattening, doing things like flattening the knots to make it smooth, shaping the points and abrading. So we could see a whole sequence of different manufacturing process. And we still need to do more work to think about what tools were involved in those processes.
Slide, Phase 2, Use, Maintenance and Discard. The points of 2 spears and a close-up view of the wood grain.
We have some idea of how they were kind of used, why they might have been discarded. This needs more work, but we could see here in the middle of the throwing stick, for example, some polish, which suggests that they were handling this object for a long period of time. And in this case, we think it didn't break, so we think they probably lost it. But we see other evidence, like here on the point of spear 5, we see that they were resharpening too. So they were probably kind of blunting the spears when they're using them, resharpening them, investing and keeping them sharp and using them over a long period of time.
Slide, Phase 3, Taphonomy. Close-up views of the wood grain and a graph.
We could also see marks associated with what we call taphonomy or the burial phase. So we could see these kind of what we think were hoof marks of animals treading on the soft wood after it had been buried, and things like rot and stuff like that. So we could characterize all these different phases of these tools.
Slide, Phase 4, Excavation and Post-Excavation. Close-up views of the stick from different angles.
And we could see what happens after excavation too. So this kind of blue mineralization that can happen on the wood, some splits that can start to happen because the wood's wet and it's really soft. So it's challenging material, but we could also look at old excavation photos and see if a break, for example, happened after the excavation.
Slide, Numerous spears and sticks.
So as a result of all this kind of looking at the whole assemblage, the team was able to find not just more weapons and broken pieces of weapons, but also these kind of small split wood tools. So this now is the earliest evidence we have of wood splitting in the archaeological record. And they seem to be making these kind of small pointed and rounded wood tools at the site, and we're not completely sure what they're using these for. One hypothesis is to work soft materials like hides, for example, hide working. And you see in the top right, you see a possible bone tool from Schoeningen as well, which might have been a hide working tool as well. So this is one idea, is that these other types of tools, there's other things going on at Schoeningen too, right? They're not just hunting, they're also processing things, materials and the animals that they're hunting.
Slide, an illustration of the process of creating spears, starting with a person cutting down a tree and ending with the spear end being shaped.
So this allowed us to kind of reconstruct this whole sequence of woodworking and see that this process was really involved and it was deliberate. They followed a plan for the wood tools over and over again that followed a particular sequence. And this is quite sophisticated technologically. So although the tools themselves might look quite simple, they seem to be designed in a way that they're balanced in order to fly. You know, the spear, at least some of the spears, probably not all of them. We've got these wooden throwing sticks, so this does support the idea that they're using these to throw at, that they're throwing at prey. They might have been using fire. That's been a little bit more challenging to say for sure. But at any rate, we see a real sophistication in the design and the woodworking strategies and curating the tools. What I mean by that is repairing them if they kind of get damaged, and then recycling them into other sorts of wood tools as well. So a whole sequence of different things going on.
Slide. An article titled 430,000-year-old wooden handheld tools are earliest ever found. Close-up views of a tool.
And then as a result of kind of doing this in-depth work, and all their other teams as well, looking at early wood tools, I've been lucky enough to be part of a different team working at this incredible site called Maratusa 1 in Greece, which is 430,000 years old. And although they're not beautiful tools, we found a couple of wood tools in a natural assemblage, mostly background wood, but it's really difficult materials, really challenging. And my guess is that we've missed a lot of wood in the archaeological record because we didn't necessarily know what we were looking for. It was hard to kind of, as it were, diagnose these earliest wood tools. So this was, I think, exciting to kind of push back when humans were using wood for tools and what they might have been doing with them. In this case, we think possibly on the basis of some use wear in the shape of it, some sort of a digging stick again at another sort of lake shore.
Slide. Numerous spears and sticks lined up in rows, and a reconstruction of an early human in a museum.
And just to wrap up, I want to come back to that idea that, you know, weapons are social objects. They were probably socially learnt over a long period of time. One of the interesting things to come out of excavations in the last several years at Schoningen was discovery of a series of footprints of children, including of children and adults both. And although the researchers who published that paper suggested that that meant it wasn't a hunting party, that they were probably looking for other resources, which could be true, we also kind of explored in our paper on the double-pointed stick, one of these throwing sticks, that maybe we did have kids and adolescents here as part of the hunting parties, as part of the groups of hunting. Learning to hunt is a long process. It's difficult, and it's a part of a community of practice. And as you can maybe see here, we've got lots of different sizes of spears too, right? There's big, massive ones, but there's also quite delicate and shorter spears as well. So this allows us to, you know, ask those kind of more challenging social questions about, you know, who might have been present and who might have been engaging in these activities. So I will stop there and hope I didn't talk for too long and stop sharing my screen.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Now, that was perfect timing. And we have questions coming in already. But I think I'm actually going to start with one of the behind the scenes questions, which, okay, spoiler, is from me. I'm wondering, and I know this is a little bit different than your expertise, but are there certain environments that are just better for preserving wood? Like, do you see a pattern of where you might find wooden tools?
Yes. So there are kind of four different preservation environments for wood, and they are very wet anaerobic conditions. So more or less very little, I wouldn't say no bacteria because we have bacterial rot at Schoningen, for example, a little bit, but most very low levels of bacteria where the wood doesn't rot away. Um, Dry, very, very dry conditions. So we have some examples. I think Arambalsa 3, which is one of those Neanderthal tools, is from a very dry context. I might have got that wrong, but certainly some cave type sites which have wood preservation. You can also have, of course, wood preserved in the ice, and there's some really nice project going on in Beringia that is discovering, you know, I think citizen science people discovering these these objects melting out of the ice and then, getting them conserved quite quickly before they disintegrate. And then the last one, oddly, which I just learned myself recently, is salt. So sometimes wood
Hmm.
can preserve in sort of salt caves and things like that. But
Interesting.
most of the archaeological wood we have from the Pleistocene is wet.
Ah,
Wet.
okay.
Yeah, almost all of
Okay.
it. Yeah.
So here's a question from Christoph who asks, were these spears from Schoningen intentionally deposited or were they just left somewhere?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think there have been various theories about this over the years, and we've had various debates as a team, what was going on. My personal view is that these were probably quite heavily invested objects. And so we do see breaks on a lot of the spears that look consistent with use. So when I used various spear replicas on animal carcasses to see if they work on animals, which they do, and other not dead, not live ones, I should say. I should clarify. Um, but also in just when they're thrown, we can see sort of certain characteristic types of breaks. So we see breaks that look like that when they break when they're very wet or old after burial, they break in a different way. So, although I can't say for sure that that's how they broke, it does look like at least some of them broke when they were being used. And that would be a reason for discard, for leaving it behind. I think other objects like there was that one double pointed stick, which was the first object found, is way off on the lake
Hmm.
shore in comparison to everything else. And my guess is that was lost in the reeds on the lake shore. So I think there's different reasons why they might have left them. There's been some idea that they might have kind of been caching the spears there. But there's a problem with that, which is that it would have been very wet. And actually you don't want your wood tools to stay wet because they will rot. And yeah, so once they're dry, you don't want to keep them. You don't want to re-wet them. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to me that they were kind of cached there or kept there.
This leads me to ask, are in the sites where wooden tools are found, do they tend to be clustered as opposed to sort of like one here and one there? If there's even a pattern that you can tell at this point?
Um, Interesting. I'm trying to think. Like so many of the sites are just one.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Okay.
Clacton and Laringen and Arambalza are just one. Pageti Vecchi, which is the kind of Neanderthal with multifunctional sticks. My memory of that is they're kind of clustered around a butchered elephant. So for
Hmm.
whatever reason, we seem to see these wood tools often in association with small stone tool technologies and
Hmm.
often with large prey, but in particular elephants. So Maratusa, Pageti Vecchi, Laringen are all associated with elephant remains. That could just be coincidental, but
Hmm.
I don't know. There's so few that it's hard to say if there's a pattern.
Okay, interesting.
Hmm.
Since you also mentioned about stone, I'm going to ask this question from Steve, who asks, did wooden weapons predate stone-tipped projectiles? And then a second part of the question, is there evidence that early humans combined wood with other materials like bone or resin for weaponry?
Yes, but so the answer to the first question is that wooden spears do precede stone-tipped spears in the European context.
Hmm.
So the earliest stone points, but I will say, because this is what I've been doing my research on more recently, it is controversial when a stone point was a weapon point.
Mm.
But we do, because it can be other things like knives. And there are big debates around when is a stone point a projectile. But
Hmm.
broadly speaking, in Europe, we seem to see stone points for spears appear sometime around 200,000, um, around the same time period that we start to see things like glue, birch tar
Mm.
as well. There is a site in Africa, which, again, this is controversial, but that called Katupan, where there are stone points that are thought to have been weapon points as well. So these are all thought to be spears because they're larger. And then the second question was combining different materials, wasn't it,
Hmm.
into like composite tools?
Yeah,
So
combining wood with bone or resin or something like that. Hmm.
yeah, so I mean, what we're seeing in the period that I'm studying, when we see the wood tools, is that we do see the use of wood, we see use of bone
Hmm.
and use of stone, but we don't seem to see until about 200,000 and later them starting to combine those into tools together. They might have been doing that,
Hmm.
but we don't see it. So the earliest, maybe those handles from Schoeningen, if they're handles could have been
Hmm.
composite tools. But if not, the next earliest is Pagetti Vecchi from 171, where we have the handles, some sort of tool handle in wood. So yeah, it
Okay.
seems to be that the combining of materials into a single tool seems to be a bit later.
Later. Okay. And from
Yeah.
my recollection, the Katupan date in South Africa is about 500,000. So would be a little bit earlier than other
Yeah, it would
things.
be earlier.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if the date's right and people accept them as weapon points, then yes,
Hmm.
that would be the earliest. Yeah.
Yeah. A question from Jeff who asks, did they use other sticks and whatever to increase distance or power, or did they just throw these by hand?
Yeah, good question. So the idea of launching a weapon using something else, so kind of what we call maybe mechanical projected weapons are, so spear thrower is one, and a bow and
Mm.
arrow works differently, but is another, does seem to be a Homo sapiens innovation. So they would have been using all of these, we think, technologies by hand. So either thrusting them, or if you accept that they were throwing, then throwing them. So not everybody
Okay.
agrees on that, but yeah, but by hand, yes.
Okay. Great. So Walter asks, says, I'm interested in the energy involved in throwing and hunting with spears. How far could your experimental subjects travel before they felt a need to eat, hydrate, and rest?
Oh, experimentally. Interesting. I don't know. That's a good question. Because we didn't work like that. I provided trays of
Mm.
sandwiches and water bottles. Yeah, it's a good question. I think something like agent-based modeling, like computer modeling, would
Mm.
be good at answering those kinds of questions.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, humans are pretty like resilient, right? When we need to be, we can do pretty incredible things, as we
Hmm.
can see today.
I'm going to go to one of our behind the scenes questions. And so, for the wooden spears, is there a significant behavioral difference between intentional design for balance and shape versus you think trial and error? And if there's a way to see that? And is it significant to know the difference between an expert creating with forethought versus an amateur just like trying and fixing as they go?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So there's been some really nice work by an archaeologist, Miriam Heidel, who's thought a lot about the kind of the different sequences of actions and thought behind technologies, and she's looked at wooden spears and their design in particular as well. I would say that one of the reasons Shining is so amazing is because we have a whole collection of the
Mm,
same sort of thing, but they're different. So as you could see, there's different sizes of spears, but they're always doing the same thing in certain regards, right? So they're always using a trunk for the spears.
okay.
They're always using the base of the trunk for the front point. And they're always making sure that the soft center of the wood, the softest bit, does not come out at the point itself.
Mm,
They seem to be selecting other features. They're selecting slow growing spruce, even though that wood wasn't available at the lakeshore, so they must have been making their spears, getting their raw material somewhere else. So Shining is special because it shows us that they have a plan. For,
mm,
to my mind, if you do the same thing every time, then there's a plan behind that, even if there's variability around that plan in terms of how big or small the spear itself is. So I
hmm.
would say that we could see in this case, I would argue not everybody would agree, but I would argue that there's intentionality with selection of the raw material itself and how they organize the tool around that raw material. Other aspects like the balance point we can guess at that
Mhm.
because so we've done kind of some sort of fancy statistics, morphometric studies where I can kind of guess where a balance point would have been based on where the thickest part of the spear is. So it's a guess, but they correlate fairly well. And at least with some of the spears, or I would say most of the spears, that balance point seems to be located in the front of half of the spear, which means that it's possible that it would fly. Now, not all of the spears, some of them, like spear 6, is huge, and it also has a big natural kink in it.
Mm.
And so that probably means that it wouldn't have flown very well at all.
Mhm.
But those ideas that they were too heavy, they didn't bear out with the replicas. They were very similar weights to modern Olympic male javelin athletes javelin. So spear too, anyway. So they're not too heavy. So yeah, yeah. Does that answer the question, or am I
Yeah,
just
it
rambling?
does.
Okay.
No, no, it doesn't. Actually, you touched a lot on another one of our behind the scenes questions, which was about like raw material choice and transport, and is there any evidence of that for wooden tools and weapons? And so it sounds like the answer is yes. And I guess my next question would be like, do you have any sense of how far people went to get the wood that they wanted?
Yeah. No.
Yeah, fair.
Not really.
Yeah.
So we've kind of made some guesses in our papers, which is that they could have been, a few kilometers distant. There's no pollen
Hmm.
at the site there's
Mm,
very little pollen that indicates that
hmm.
spruce and pine were nearby. So
Hmm.
it could have been as far as, tens of kilometers from the Harz Mountains, for example. But yeah, it's hard to say
Okay.
exactly
Yeah.
where, but not at the site, not from, so they weren't, they were doing woodworking at the site, but that was probably that kind of the splitting and the reworking of wood
Hmm.
rather than, and using the kind of wood that from previous tools to make kind of expedient tools on site. But yeah, how far, I'm not sure. I think it's really hard to say. Yeah,
Okay.
where were they living? That's the other,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
we're probably not there is my guess, but
I want to pick up on expediency in a moment, but I'm going to go to one of the other audience questions first. So Niels asks, given the distances that these spears can be thrown, do you know what hunting techniques might have been used? Chasing prey, ambushing, using hunting blinds?
yeah, so that is certainly one of the areas of debate. So the idea that they were close contact weapons only does limit, if you follow that and think they weren't
Mm,
throwing at all, it limits in a way the sorts of strategies. So if you're a
hmm.
close hunting fan for Schoeningen, then they're going to have to kind of ambush the animals
Yeah.
some way. And the theory is that they would have kind of disadvantage them by getting them stuck in the mud at the lake shore.
Hmm.
But if you're hunting from a bit more of a distance, you have some more options. My guess is that it's not endurance hunting, right? Because they're at a lake shore, and so they're not chasing the animals for miles and miles, and it's also horses. So you probably wouldn't be doing that. But, possibly they could have, in theory, there could have been things like hunting blinds, but you also have the tall reeds at the lake shore, so that's another idea is that they could have been hiding humans could have hidden amongst the
Mm,
reeds, and come upon the herds quickly in that way. So I mean, there's a lot of conjecture around that, but I guess what I would say was that from the ethnographic review of wooden spear hunting, that pretty much all of the strategies were represented with the spear
ah,
hunting with when I tracked, so this idea that it's only disadvantage hunting, it doesn't necessarily go with the ethnographic literature. At
mm.
any rate, all of those types of strategies were represented in the
Oh,
ethnographic.
cool.
Yeah.
Okay. I will ask another audience question, a little bit of a different topic, but Urate asks, have wooden objects ever been found as funeral goods in a burial site?
Ooh, yes, but from much, much later
Mm,
time periods. So I was actually in Tenerife last year for a really nice workshop on plant technologies, and they have a lot of like indigenous cave burials where there's a lot of wood preservation with the mummification with the mummies in these caves, so planks and things like that. I happen I think there might be some from important objects from the Americas as well. But yeah, burial is primarily associated with Homo sapiens, not
Mhm.
exclusively, but certainly grave goods and things like that as well. So we don't, yeah, not for the period I study, but for
Yeah.
later stuff for sure.
Okay. And so here's also sort of a different topic-ish question, but Sue asks, is there any evidence of wooden slings this early? And they clarified slings as in early catapults or stone throwers.
Yeah, good question. Because that would be a really cool technology to find, but no, not yet.
Hmm.
So again, that would be almost kind of a mechanical type concept, similar to
Yeah.
bow and arrow, where you've got um, you kind of capture energy that then gets released when you
Hmm.
release it. But yeah, I think the earliest slings might be even in the Americas, actually. They
Hmm.
have earliest evidence of slings, and one of them buried with a child, which I've always loved that. Yeah.
So Christoph asks, how sure are we about the dating of these sites? I don't know if you want to give any like overviews from the different sites.
So the dating of these early sites is always challenging. Re- and they do get dated and redated. So when Schoningen was first discovered, it was thought to be 400,000, and then it was redated to 300,000. And then recently, one team has redated it and suggests it's even earlier at 200,000. Not everybody
Or
agrees.
later, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, that's difficult. Some sites are better and easier to date, but also than others for various reasons. Yeah, it depends. It depends on the site, um,
Hmm.
but how confident we can be. But it does matter because you could, 100,000 year difference can make a big difference. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So here's also a slightly different kind of question. So Marina asks, is there any evidence of tree worshiping? And I'm thinking what you would look for to find that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of those behaviors that are just so archaeologically challenging to see.
Hmm.
You know, never rule anything out, I guess.
Right.
I, but no, we don't have any evidence of anything like that. No.
Okay. I'm going to go back to expediency. So one of our behind the scenes questions was, so wooden tools are often explained away as being used for their expediency of manufacture. They're quick to make, or that they can be shaped really easily relative to stone. But are there some kinds of tools that you think wood as a material is advantageous relative to stone? And so, like, if you're an expert, you would rather have a wooden tool for that, like, use wood to make this kind of tool versus use stone to make this kind of tool.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So actually, woodworking is really difficult. It takes a long time and it's
Mm,
much quicker to make a stone tool. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is less skill involved in making a stone tool because obviously they're hard things to learn how to make. But woodworking is slow, and especially because um, I've read sort of ethnographically, but also, I mean, when we do things as Westerners, we're not so good at doing them, but it's slow. And the wood itself that they were almost always selecting was really hard wood. They were not
hmm.
selecting the easiest wood to carve, which is also really interesting. Most of the time, there are some exceptions to that. So that earliest wood tool from Marathusa is alder, which is not so difficult.
Hmm.
So there might be some examples where they're doing like very little, just taking off a couple branches, doing a bit of
Hmm.
debarking, and that's it. But things
Hmm.
like the Schoningen spears would have taken hours and hours and hours to make, whereas you can make a stone
Hmm.
tool in 15 minutes,
Yeah.
10, 15 minutes. So I would actually say that making wood tools is a much bigger investment. And the question is then if you have a wooden spear, so what we do see is we see wooden spears being used even when these other innovations come in. So we see stone tip spears, we see bone pointed weapons, but even in recent times, wooden weapons continue to be used too. So there are questions that need answering as to why. And the answer to why is, I think, probably variable. So maybe
Mm,
wood is a little bit more durable and reliable. It doesn't break as easily as a stone point, for example. Um, you also don't need to do as many things. Then, if you need a wood shaft anyway, if you're going to add a stone point or a bone point, you need the wood shaft or for the spear anyway. So you have to
mm-hmm,
do both and get the stone and make the glue and find your string and all these other components. So maybe an advantage is still time. Um,
mm,
but and then there may or may not be kind of different advantages around wounding, which is some of the more recent experiments that we've done. So stone, for example, we think makes, and this supports other people's experiments too, makes larger wounds. So they both seem
huh,
to penetrate as deeply as the other. So there's not, like, hitting the heart is fine for both wood and stone, but the stone points, even if you keep the shape the same and the energy exactly the same, the stone points cut a bigger hole. So that's
huh,
really interesting. So there might be advantages and disadvantages of both, of all these different sorts of materials.
yeah. I'm wondering if anyone has ever, or whether this would be worthwhile, sort of looked at stone tools associated with wooden tools to see if you could tell from the edges of the stone tools, like, are there traces of wood? Are there phytoliths? Are there ways to say,
Yeah,
like, this stone tool was used to, I mean, I'm envisioning like you're spending a lot of time smoothing,
yeah.
scraping wood. Does anyone even look for that?
Yep. So people have found use wear on stone tools at most of the sites that have the wood. So there's use wear for woodworking, what we call use wear on the stone tools
Mm-hmm.
shining
Yeah.
in. There is also evidence of that at Maratusa, where we have the stone tools and the wood tools and the bone tools. So there's evidence on some of
Mm-hmm.
the stone tools of woodworking or at least plant working. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, I actually don't know how specifically well this is accepted, but there is evidence from a very early African site of phytoliths and woodworking evidence on stone tools from like 1 point something, 7, I want to say 1.7 million. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they could have been using stone tools to work wood way, way earlier than we see the wood.
Another thing that I was thinking about things transferring to other surfaces is, do you think there would be any chance of getting like human DNA from the tools? I don't know if
Yeah,
anybody's ever looked for that. I mean, maybe that's just not possible, but
I I don't, I mean, I've thought about that with, particularly with animal DNA too. Like if
and that. Oh
we're
yeah, what they're
penetrating into the animals, then
yeah.
potentially, yeah. I think there is potential there.
Hmm.
And one of the problems is that we have is just the conservation issues.
Yeah.
But they have conserved, or also because they're sitting in water for a long time, if the
Yeah.
DNA would stay on it. But yeah, it would be
Hmm.
really cool, wouldn't it? If they could, I mean, they're getting DNA out of sediments and things now, aren't they?
Exactly. That's what I was
Oh,
thinking.
I
Yeah.
think in theory it could work, but yeah.
Hmm. And so, speaking of tools sitting in water, Niels asked, how long can wooden weapons and other tools preserve in cold, deep water? And have there been any efforts to find ancient wooden tools in, I guess, current lakes or inlets or anything like that?
Oh. I don't know. I feel like feel a bit stumped. How long would, yeah, in like sort of very deep lakes that have been lakes forever.
Hmm.
I don't know. And that's a very good question. I'm a bit stumped on that one. But no, I don't. I mean, certainly we have like examples of wood preservation from lakes, from stuff that's much from actual lakes that's much later. But
Hmm.
yeah, go
That's an
dive.
experiment waiting to
Yeah, go
happen, I
go go
guess.
go diving. I don't know. I can't dive.
Exactly.
So.
Another question from Urate, who says, it seems like wood tools would be preserved in the same environments that braided grasses would be preserved. Are there any suggestions of baskets ever found near wood tools?
So the earliest evidence I think of string is is Neanderthal, but it's much
Hmm.
later. So Bruce Hardy.
Yeah. He
Was
gave one of our hot topics
Oh, did
previously,
he?
if
Okay.
anybody wants to watch it. Yes,
Yeah. So maybe
about
you can
this.
answer more clearly than I can. But that's only like a little, it's like a tiny little fragment,
Hmm.
a twist of some twisted organic material. So much later than the time period I look at. But yeah, I mean, it would be really interesting to see when they start making string, when they start making containers.
Hmm.
It's just so hard with this. What do people call it? The tyranny of the tangible, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
like I
That's
love
great.
that because it's so
Hmm.
true. We're probably missing loads of things
Yeah.
doing.
I have two last questions for you, both from behind the scenes. The first is for me. Have you read the book about the Wood Age? And I'm curious if you
Yes,
enjoy it. Yeah. Hmm.
I have read it. I what should I say?
I can ask the next question. How about that? If that's
I don't find answers. So it's written by a wood engineer and not
ah,
a an archaeologist. And
okay.
so, as an archaeologist, so there are some things in there that are really great, and I really are I totally agree with, and other things that I think aren't quite right. Um,
Hmm.
and so, but also there are other things in there because it's a wood engineer that I didn't know that are really
Hmm.
interesting. So
Okay.
it's a bit of
A
I
bit of
enjoy
both.
a bit of both. Yeah.
And there's another book that I'm thinking of called The Botanical or the
Yes.
Botanic Age. That's maybe the one that I was thinking of. I don't know if you've read that one as
I
well.
have not read that yet, but it's
Yeah.
definitely on my my bedside table chunk of books to get through. Yeah, have you read it?
I did. I read it I recently and I quite liked it actually.
Yeah, is it
Yeah.
Dean Falk? Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
No, I would. That's definitely on my reading list.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And for anyone on the Zoom, also, we have a list on the Human Origins website of recommended books, and we give little descriptions of each book. And so I wrote a little description for that one when I read it recently.
that's cool.
Um, and I will ask the last question before we wrap up. So beyond weapons being cool, this is a behind the scenes question. Of course, what brought you to this field and what has kept you so interested in this topic? And have your research interests fluctuated or changed since undergrad to grad school, etc.?
Okay. So what brought me to it? I had a background in as a violinist before I got into archaeology. So I had a undergraduate master's and then a fellowship in an orchestra
Oh,
in
cool.
Miami. And then I had an accident and I decided to get into archaeology rather randomly. So I think as I was explaining to you before, I knew very little and I had to learn everything very quickly. So So, as a result, I kind of got given a topic on early weapons for my master's dissertation by Matt Pope, who is a brilliant archaeologist, Paleolithic archaeologist. And I did get just kind of grabbed by it because I ended up doing that experimental archaeology with the Defense Academy here in the UK and ballistics experts in their labs, and they were just amazing. And everybody was super supportive, even though I knew nothing. So I kind of because I think I had this kind of background in embodied skill, I was really, as a violinist, and I had, as a violinist, everyone's like, well, I could do that. I could pick it, like, no, you couldn't. So I started when I was 4, and it's really hard. That I was kind of interested in how archaeology and archaeologists were interpreting tools in a very kind of Western, this is really easy. I could do it. If I throw this, it would be, I know I could hunt, really easily
Mm,
like this. And I think I think I sort of took a step back and thought, okay, actually, that's really interesting how people would have learned these technologies. And I guess one of the things I would say about the early tools is that they're sophisticated, and maybe not just in how they're designed, but the social structures and how people learn to use these tools and their communities of practice and how people learn how to successfully hunt. So a simpler tool might be harder to learn to use. A bow and arrow might be easier.
mm-hmm.
And so I think I've gotten kind of interested in archaeology of children and stuff like that because I'm interested in the skills around the technologies themselves. So
Oh, very
hopefully
cool.
that kind of wraps the questions up and what I want to say about the technologies themselves.
That's excellent. So, thank you. I'm going to wrap up and conclude today's virtual program. So, please join me in thanking Dr. Milks for sharing her work with us. I'd also like to give special thanks to those who made this program possible, to our behind the scenes team who helped sort through your questions, including Dr. Ryan McRae, to our donors, volunteers, and viewers like you, and finally to all our partners who help us reach, educate, and empower millions of people around the world. Today and every day, we thank you. Next month, we'll be featuring University Professor of Human Origins at George Washington University, Bernard Wood, on May 21st for our final hot topic of the spring. So you can grab a free ticket at the link in the Q&A to that hot topic and find out more information on our website and in your email. We've put a link in the Q&A where you can find information about other upcoming programs and how to sign up for the museum's weekly e-newsletter. That's really the best way to stay informed about upcoming programs and to learn more about the museum's research and exhibits. After this webinar ends, you'll see a survey pop up asking for some feedback about the program. Please take a moment to respond. We're very curious to know what topics you might be interested in seeing for future programs, and we appreciate your input. And again, thank you to the participants, thank you to our presenter, Dr. Milks, and thank you to you, the audience. We'll see you next month.
Text. National Museum of Natural History. Smithsonian.